Good evening, folks. Old Buster coming to you again. Got another story for you. Driving fast and living large. I done told you Jesse hollered to Walter whilst Buster was a-yelling for him to go faster. I was just a-grinning from ear to ear 'cause he liked speed too, you know. He just loved to see Walter a-devilin' Jesse driving so fast. The red and blue lights was a-flashing when Walter pulled over to the side of the road. Jesse said to Walter that he was going to get himself a ticket and wasn't no way out of it this time. There was 6 of them in the car. The boys and 2 of the Britton cousins. They had all been out to a little party, and that old McBrayer kind of snuck up on Walter. First off, they began to playing pitch at Ebert's with some of the boys from down there at Tar Bottoms, and then headed on over to the 1170 Club down by the river. Buster and Jesse wasn't going steady with nobody at this time, but hired Walter, had that snow gal and Alma May. And little Lou Ann, they was a seeing regular like. Well, Lou Ann was a pistol for sure. She was chin high to Walter and toted tomahawks with her everywhere she went. That is to say, she was half French and half Indian. Walter said when you got her riled, it was like tangling with a bobcat. We seed her set old Walter to sail a time or two, that's for sure. Of course, the boys was the cause of that on occasion, of getting Walter to do something she didn't want him to do. Excuse me. Well, Buster did see that 6-foot-tall Indian gal that worked over at the Holiday Inn by the name of Bonnie Wahila Emma Sullins Morgan for a time, but 'tweren't nothing serious. She was tall enough to dance with, though. Now, Jesse, on the other hand, had more gals than Carter had little liver pills, with them pheromones of his a-popping out all the time. About when he thought he had them under control, they'd pop out and a gal would come right out of the woodwork, it seemed, in the least likely places, and one of them would latch on to old Jesse. Well, one time, Jesse was walking by a storefront downtown with his and Pa, and just decided to get some 20 Mule Team borax at Sam's 5 and Dime on the corner. Plus, it was coming up on his and Ma's birthday, and him and his pa reckoned they would get her a present whilst they was out. They didn't get to the city too often, and this was as good a time as any. When Jesse and his and pa went to the store, the lady at the counter was plumb Google-eyed over Jesse and told his and pa she wanted him to take out her daughter. She even had her picture, and she showed him. Her name was Jenny, and she was right pretty thing and a rodeo queen to boot. She barrel raced and was real good at it, too. Well, Mr. McBrayer got to talking to the lady for quite a spell and come to find out they knowed some of the same people. Mr. McBrayer invited all the Olivers over for supper after church on the following Wednesday so they could all meet and visit. Well, now, Jesse was fit to be tied, I tell you. He told his and Paul he just wasn't up to no courting 'cause he had business and lawyering on his mind. Lord, he'd been a-helping Mr. Lamar Green there in town and his law office and was studying up on contracts and such. Now, Mr. McBrayer said, now, Jesse, you got to be sociable, and if a gal's ma asks you to take escort to her daughter, you ought to appreciate that. They seem to be good Christian folk and want a nice feller like yourself that has good reason to be friends with their gal. Now, it was a right nice compliment for Jesse and his folks, so he reckoned he would take her out for ice cream at Leake's drugstore and the picture show on Saturday if it all went well on Wednesday evening. Both Jesse's ma and pa was happy about that, I tell you. Anyhow, back to Walter and the police. 2 state troopers come up to the car and asked for Walter's driver's license and checked him on out. Now, all the rest of the boys stayed in the car whilst they took Walter and put him in the back seat of the police car. Now, whilst the troopers was waiting for word on Walter, they began to talking about how dry it was in them parts. Walter said he didn't mean to interrupt, but down in Groom, it was so dry a tree had to chase a dog. Them 2 troopers just busted out a laughing. About that time, the radio come on and the dispatcher said Walter was clean. Them 2 troopers just looked at each other, still a-laughing, and told Walter to get on out of their car, but to drive the speed limit. Walter had him a snoot full and told Buster to drive on home. Excuse me, folks. Walter done got out of another, and Jesse said Walter was luckier than an outhouse rat. He could talk the brass horns off a billy goat. Well, Saturday after the picture show, Miss Inez asked the boys to help clean up the trash left in the rows, and they said they could have 2 passes each. Well, the boys said there weren't no need of that, excuse me, and they would be proud to do it. They had that building spick and span in no time flat, and Miss Inez gave them passes anyhow. While they was there, they found a billfold of cash and papers. It belonged to a feller passing through town that had a little time to kill, so he went to the picture show. The feller was a Yankee, but Indian, looking for oil and gas leases in the area and also looking for somebody to invest in an oil and gas well. Seems he had a partner that just died and had come from the funeral at AGIN Switch and had to wait whilst the car was fixed over at Baxley Texaco station. Loomis had to come over and do some welding on the axle too. Anyhow, the feller had a lease over in Oklahoma for a gas and oil well and was flat busted except in what he had his in billfold. That's when he rolled on through town and had to wait a bit, so he went to the picture show. He needed a stake to prove up the well and knowed it'd pay off. Wildcatting was a gamble for sure, but he just had a good feeling about the well coming in, is what he said. When the boys caught up with the feller, he was plumb dejected, sitting on the side of the road out of gas. Buster had a 5-gallon can of Amoco gas in his truck, and he put that in the feller's tank. Well, Hired handed over the feller's billfold and told him they found it in the picture show. The boys knowed which way he was a-going when Acey and Loomis over at the station told him the direction he was heading in. The boys got into Humming Oak and had coffee with the feller, and he sure enough appreciated what they done. He offered them a reward, but the boys wouldn't take it. He told them all about the gas and oil leases and his partner. He said he was a-looking for a stake, and he dang well knowed it'd make a pile of greenbacks. Sure, wildcatting was a gamble, but not when he knowed it was right under his feet. The feller was called Joe Whitetail, and he was a Cherokee and Kootenai Indian. He was raised with his and Ma in Oklahoma till he was 13 and moved with his and Paul after his and Ma died. He said he knowed every inch of that Anadarko basin and could even show him where the gas come from right out of the ground like an artesian well. Well, I'm going to tell you, that got Jesse's attention right there. The boys asked him when he was going back to Oklahoma to prove up the well, and he told them about a month when he settled some things in Sandpoint, Idaho, where he was from. The boys give Joe their contact information and to call him when he was headed back. They just might want to hook up with him again. Well, Joe said he would, and thanked them all again for bringing his billfold to him. It was right neighborly, and he knowed they was all good men. Well, the boys done sniffed out another adventure, it seems. They figured they could jump in and help Joe, cause Hired was good with heavy equipment, and Walter could weld a pipe and anything else for that matter. Buster was stout as an ox and would work like a Turk, and Jesse would do the researching, plus all of them was smart as a whip. Well, Jesse's pa and Uncle Cecil worked for Southern Natural Gas and knowed all about gas wells. Heck, fire, that's how his family got in the gas business, because one of them surface wells, Jesse and his pa and Uncle knowed for sure surface wells was a fact saying how they had one of them. Well, coming on to summer, Joe Whitetail called up the boys and said he was a-coming through to go back to Oklahoma and said he wanted to stop and visit for a bit. Well, Jesse's ma said to come on to the house and they would have a big supper and all the boys and their folks would be there and visit with him one evening. Well, the boys then made up their minds to go with Joe and told their folks what they was going to do. Since they was all old enough to make decisions on their own and had their own money and school was out, they didn't make no never mind where they went and what they did. Well, not really, but you know what I mean. The boys' folks had plenty of help, and no day would be careful, and Uncle Cecil and Aunt Liz lived out that way too in Weatherford, and would keep an eye out for them. The boys had their money from their various business enterprises and decided to go whole hog if it looked like a good thing to do. Well, Jesse pretty well would fill them in on what all was in the gas and oil business. Well, Jesse's pa and Uncle Cecil and the folks they know that's on that could advise them too, you know. Well, Joe come on in a couple of days later, and Ms. McBrayer and Ms. Ollinger and Buster's grandma Clara fixed up a feast fit for a king. Walter and Jesse's sisters come to supper too, and since Joe was single, young and good looking, they was more than willing to help and stay for a spell. During supper, everybody visited, and Joe told about his raising his folks. And Joe was 24 and sure enough had the drive to make this deal work if he could get a little cash. Well, after supper, all the folks went into the parlor for homemade vanilla ice cream that Buster's grandma made, and fresh peach pie and chocolate cake. Fresh coffee and sweet iced tea wetted their whistles, and then the boys told Joe they was going to invest and work with Joe in Oklahoma and bring in his well. The folks told Joe the boys had the money and wanted to do this if and he wanted them in on it. The split would be 5 equal ways, said Joe, if and they agreed. Well, the boys sure enough liked the idea, but told Joe to make it 50-50. The boys half and him half. Joe pretty near fell out of his chair and about shed a tear when they said that, you know. But Joe told the folks that these here boys were mighty fine young men, would always be his and brothers. He said they come by it honest, and they're raising, and they could be right proud of them. Well, the next day the boys started gathering up their belongings for the trip and tools too. They made an arrangement at the bank for the money to be used in an account for the venture. They called their company, the new company, Five Brothers Expedition. No, Exploration, I guess it is. I can't read my own writing. Five Brothers Exploration. Well, Joe went on ahead the next day, and the boys would meet up with them in a day or two when they was ready to leave. Joe said they was going to tap that artesian gas well first and get that to going, and then drill with the money they would make off the first well. It was a plan. Well, Buster and Walter and Jesse took Buster's Ford, and Hired got Belle ready to fly and flew her to where they was going to be. They figured if they had to go someplace fast, that Belle was the best way, plus Hired wanted to keep up with his and tricks by practicing when he had the chance. Joe and the boys settled in Elk City, about 42 miles from Weatherford, where Jesse's Uncle Cecil lived. Joe and the boys, with Uncle Cecil's help, began to gather up the equipment they was going to need and hired an old wildcatter to open up that artesian gas well. Old Sam Riggins was a crusty old feller, but took a liking to all the boys. Uncle Cecil knowed Sam and got him to sign on. It wasn't long that they had that well tapped and capped, and Sonat bought all the gas they could pump from that well. The boys put in $150,000 into Five Brothers Exploration and made a tidy profit for every cubic foot of gas sold. Their advance was enough to pay off all the debts and pocketed $50,000 apiece, with a nice bonus for Sam. Joe told the boys that they was ready to drill now, and if they wanted to keep on drilling with him, they was ready to go. At supper one night at Uncle Cecil's, they all discussed their plans. Uncle Cecil had the deal made with Sonat for all the gas they could get, and any oil too if they struck some. Well, the next well wasn't quite as easy as the first surface well, but old Sam brought her in. By this time, he done gathered up a real good crew, and things was a-running smooth like. When number 2 was hit, some dang ambulance chasing lawyer began to give some grief and to stir up trouble. Something about Joe's day partners people wanting in on the profits off the wells. Well, Joe had his papers, and they was all in order, leaving him full ownership of the leases. The contract stated that if one of them died, the other one would get his in half. Since they never did drill nor made any money, there wasn't nothing to split. Well, one day Joe went into Oklahoma City with Hired and Belle to see a lawyer about all the fuss. Well, Hired went to see the sights of the town whilst he was awaiting for Joe, but Joe never showed. Joe was kidnapped, and a ransom note was left on Belle at the airstrip. Hired called the police and the boys, and Uncle Cecil come with the boys to Oklahoma City to find out what was happening and all the goings on. The note said that they wanted the contract and all the rights to the wells, or Joe was going to end up dead. Well, that evening at the motel, Buster said to Walter, Hired, and Jesse that they had to do something, and he had an idea. First off, Hired was not to feel bad about Joe being kidnapped. It wasn't his fault. Next off, they agreed to call Mr. Holmes, and for help from Dalton and Devane. They all agreed, and Buster made the call. Now, Uncle Cecil also thought that was a good idea and would call all the folks from the phone in his room. The folks at Sonat gave the boys an office in their headquarters building in Oklahoma City till Joe was found. That sure helped to have a central location for support. Now, Mr. Holmes answered on the first ring. How he done that, Buster didn't know. It was like he knowed Buster was calling. Well, anyhow, Buster didn't waste no time telling Mr. Holmes what all done happened. Mr. Holmes said he'd get right on it and took all the particulars from Buster. Buster and the boys thanked Mr. Holmes and told him how much they appreciated his help. They don't know where in the world Dalton and Livin come from, but it wasn't 4 hours later that both of them landed in town and was getting the lowdown from the police. Dalton and Livin met up with the boys and Uncle Cecil at their motel and began to tell them what all they was thinking about all this. The note was on a large scrap of paper that come from Chicago, Illinois. Now, how they know that was by traces of DNA left by a paper cut. Somebody had accidentally cut themselves on the paper and didn't even know it. The DNA matched the sample from a local Russian mafia gangster there in Chicago. The feller had been arrested there for fighting in a union dispute where he might near killed the feller with a bowel bat. And DNA samples was taken for the case and was on file, so they was available to Dalton when they got the results from the lab on what was found on the note. Now, Devane told him he was leaving right then for Chicago and be in touch. Dalton phoned Mr. Holmes with the information, and that sure enough got his attention, I tell you. Come to find out after a little investigating that a cousin of Joe's day partner was ex-KGB agent and was known to be tied in with the Russian mafia in Chicago. Now, it began to add up real quick what this was all about, and Dalton set them all down, including Uncle Cecil, and give them the skinny on what they figured was going on. Them boys could get in a pickle quicker than anybody I ever heard of. But Dalton told them they'd been around the block a time or two, and this was leading to something him and Devane and Mr. Holmes knowed might be held in such secrecy that only 3 men in the world even had an idea what it was all about. They couldn't tell him right then what it all concerned, but Mr. Holmes was the only one that knowed all the details. They were just going to have to wait and see how all this played out. Well, first things first, said Dalton. Not nary word, and he meant that, not nary word. Dalton said he knowed they was going to stick to their noses into this and to keep them safe and not to get crosswise with the bad guys and the government. They all had to do exactly what Mr. Holmes said to do. It was that or they were going to be held till Joe was found. Well, they all agreed to the conditions and swore they wasn't going to take matters in their own hand. Them boys, Mr. Holmes said he wasn't kidding none about this, and South America and the Bahamas put together was a cakewalk compared to this. He also said not to ask any questions till they was briefed because they wasn't going to get no answers unless they needed one. Well, Dalton also told him that he didn't even know all the details, but it was so secret, so serious that the president didn't even know the details. There wasn't no sleeping for him, and Dalton had a plane waiting for him to go to Chicago. Now, Uncle Cecil was going to stay behind in Oak City and get things cleaned up there and then go back on to the house where they lived. He was to stand by there till all this was over. Now, Sonat was working with Mr. Holmes and Uncle Cecil because they was to be under Mr. Holmes' orders till further notice. Now, all the folks back home had their minds put to ease by Mr. Holmes and Uncle Cecil that the boys was all okay and they'd be kept informed of what all was going on, or at least as much as possible. The folks understood and knowed the drill from the past fracases they'd been in. Everything was moving real fast, and that was good. The sooner they found Joe, the better. Well, Devane had a lead on the Russian when the plane landed. His name was Boris Gorsky, and he was about to be offered a deal he couldn't refuse. Buster and Walter flew Bell to Chicago while Jesse and Hired went with Dalton. The boys wanted Bell with them and would be a bit behind, but would catch up after they stopped for some stuff there in Elk City. Now, Devane and Dalton left Jesse and Hired with the plane and took off on their own. They snatched old Boris and brung him back all trussed up at a bleeding mite, but still breathing. Devane asked Hired and Jesse if they'd recognize the feller, and Jesse said he seen him there in Elk City at the cafe, and And Howard said he seen him lollygagging around the building where their lawyer was at that Joe was supposed to meet up with. Drivin had a car, take the boys to a hotel, and he'd be back later, he said. Well, the Russian was tough as boot leather, but not as tough as he thought he was. Drivin knowed a thing or two about getting the feller to talk, and when he was done with the feller, he was singing like a canary. The boys told Dalton and Drivin where the cousin of Joe's partner was holed up, and that he had Joe. Well, Anton Petrov was Tony Peters, Joe partners, his old partner. He died of natural causes, a heart attack. Well, Tony lived in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where he met Joe, and they hooked up to make their fortune. Tony's people come from Russia and changed their name to an English version. Pavel Petrov is Tony's cousin. Now that Dalton and Livin had the location of where Pavel was a-holding Joe, it was time to fetch the boy on back home. But there was a catch to that. Believe it or not, Joe was being held at the Russian Foundation till the oil and gas conference was over that would be held there. There was a secret room in the basement, and it was heavily guarded. Well, Dalton said this was going to be a tough one, seeing how they was highly visible. But Dalton, Drivin, and Mr. Holmes come up with a plan. Mr. Holmes had to keep the fire department from answering the call of the security system, and the extraction had to be done early of a morning, like at 3 a.m. All was to go on, and the sooner the better, but the 6 guards were bad news, but the plan was still doable. Everything went off like clockwork till they come to taking out the guards. It got kind of dicey there. 2 was a guard in the stairs and elevator to the basement, and 4 guards were stationed in the hall at the door of the secret room. Well, Dalton and Drivin each took a guard, but Dalton's man pulled the trigger of his machine pistol and fired off a burst as he went down. Well, both of them were dead as a dadgum doorknob, but the alarm was sounded there. There sure enough was a shootout now, I tell you, but a couple of grenades did that trick. Time was short, and they had to move on fast. The door was locked, and none of the guards had a key. Drivin set a small charge and blew it. Joe was out cold with drugs to keep him quiet, and Drivin had him out of there in a fireman's carry. They lit out of there heading for the airport. The boys was called and told to meet them there so they could get airborne quick. Now, Pavel was nowhere to be found during the raid, and he had to be dealt with later. First thing was to get Joe up and talking. Buster and Walter was fueling up when they was contacted by radio to meet up with Dalton at a private airstrip just outside of St. Louis. A doctor would be waiting there to tend to Joe, and they'd make their plans later. Joe come round in the rooms they got after the doctor treated Joe. It took about 6 hours, and they all used the time to rest up, make plans, and gather information from Mr. Holmes. Nothing else could be done till Joe come around and told them what all he knowed. What a pickle. Well, when Joe come to, everybody was all ears. Boy, he had a tale to tell, that's for sure, and Mr. Holmes was a-listening, and he was telling his story. When Howard left Joe at the lawyer's office, somebody grabbed him from behind and stuck a rag over his mouth as he went out like a light. When he woke up, Pavel was there and began to ask questions about the boys too. Seems as he was right interested when they was up to Crow Creek in Utah on their trip. Well, Pavel was to use his cousins to get all the rights to the gas field in the Anadarko Basin, but Anton up and died before they could kill Joe. The gas field was one of the largest in the world, and the Russians wanted it. The money it would generate would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Well, Pavel had a feller come in and talk to Joe by himself about some kind of technology and what he knowed about the boys and how he met up with them. Joe said that it was sure strange to him why that feller was so interested in the boys and all, but he told him how they met in their business deal. Come to find out, Joe did have notions on what all took place up at Cold Creek. You remember Crow Creek in the story we had before on the trip with the boys. He was in then, and that kind of stuff was passed down from generation to generation. Fact is, his and people had their own brand of Julian. The feller asked Joe if he'd know where the technology was and where it come from. Well, Joe told him he had no idea, but didn't think the feller believed him. The feller even asked him if he'd talked to the aliens who brung it to Crow Creek. Joe told him he was nuts to turn him loose. The feller just turned around and left the room. Well, then old Pavel come back in, and the guards held him down, and they gave him a shot. Well, Mr. Holmes told Dalton and Devane it was just as he suspected, and to be mighty careful, that the Russians wasn't done with them yet now. About that time, they figured they'd better move on out and got into a couple of SUVs Dalton had arranged for in St. Louis. As they was driving back to the airstrip, 2 motorcycles and 2 cars pulled up alongside of the SUVs and started shooting at them. Now, the race was on, I'm telling you. Dalton was in one SUV and Devane was in the other, and they began to shooting back. Well, Dalton and Devane had extra guns and gave them to the boys and told them to keep their heads down. Well, the chase and the shootout was bringing lots of attention to the ruckus, and police sirens was heard in the distance coming. Then one of the tires was shot out, and the SUV that Walter and Jesse was riding in crashed. The driver was also wounded, but managed to get the SUV into a parking lot of a business. It was called St. Louis Motorsports. Well, Walter and Jesse run in whilst Devane and Joe hunkered down, firing back at the Russians. Walter grabbed the keys to a Lamborghini car, and Jesse jumped in. Devane and Joe made a break for the car, whilst Walter and Jesse gave them cover. The 2 motorcycles was took out a while back when one crashed and Dalton shot the other. When Devane and Joe got into a Porsche, they lit out of there like their tails was on fire. Walter was just a-grinning and a-laughing with Jesse a-hollering for him to drive faster. Well, Walter had 100 in about 4 seconds with Devane close behind. Jesse was a-jumping up and down, yelling, "Faster, Walter, faster!" Well, at 150, Walter had her leveled out and left the Russians in their dust. Devane come up behind him and blinked his lights to pull over. The police had done took over, and the Russians that was left got away but was being chased. When Buster and Howard and Dalton got there, they was stopped. Walter was a-funning Jesse about driving faster. Well, Jesse told them all that was one time he wanted Walter to drive fast since he wanted to keep his hide intact. Well, Pavel was on the run, but they'd get him. Now was the time for a meeting with Mr. Holmes, so they headed to the airstrip and took off to Washington. Belle was left there with a pilot dispatched to take her back to Elk City. Now, Mr. Holmes said for sure nothing sinister was a-brewing, and he needed to talk, there was something sinister brewing, and he needed to talk turkey with the boys and Dalton and Devane. Folks, like I tell you, I'm not one of them professionals. I'm just reading this stuff, and I'm kind of blind in one eye and can't see out the other. But anyhow, we'll get her all right. Uncle Cecil was left out of this conversation on purpose. Need to know basis, he said. Now, Mr. Holmes gave him the lowdown on what was happening. It was really a carryover of the old Russian regime and from what done happened when they all went to French Guiana. Now, y'all folks hadn't heard that story, I don't think, but if it ain't been told to you, it's coming. The pig farmers wanted to take over the United States any way they could. While them Russians didn't even have last names till 100 years ago. Control of a few over many was their agenda, and it ain't a-happening, said Mr. Holmes. The ruling class wanted to make a pile of money off the gas wells or blow them sky high, whichever they could do first. The other thing was military superiority, and this technology they were talking about ended up at Crow Creek. Now, mighty strange things happened up there, and portals was known to exist there. Aliens from a time back had a technology that they give to the Aztecs, and they moved it to Utah up at Crow Creek and buried it there. Now, the Spaniards chased them all the way to Utah, and the aliens had them go to Crow Creek where they could come and go through portals in dimensional space. Seemed far-fetched to most folks, but the boys done had a taste of it with Julian and Doc Freebot. Now, Mr. Holmes wouldn't tell the boy exactly where this here technology was buried at Crow Creek, or what it was that they had to make a trip back up there with Dalton and Drivin to show them where their experience with Julien was about. Joe said he was going too and wasn't going to be left behind. Oh, the next day all of them left out for Utah. The plane flew them into Vernal, and agents met them there with four-wheel drive SUVs and gear. Now, Walter showed Dalton and Drivin the ice cave, and Howard showed, and Jesse showed and recounted the Snake Lodge ceremony to them too, when they showed them the pictograms or pictographs on the walls and things. Buster told the story of Julien just appearing and leaving like he did, and about all the weather changes in an hour's time. All this stuff's hard to believe. All the pictures was on the rock walls, and Jeff Hinton and Jeb Wickerson come by and told all about the skinwalkers and the Sasquatch sightings. Howard was on a four-wheeler and seen them on the road home from work and asked them to come up for a beer and tell their story. Boy, I tell you, there's a whole lot of stuff to get your mind around on this. And I'm telling you folks was listening to me, I've been there. I know what I saw. Now, at the Weston Plaza Motel that night, Dalton called Mr. Holmes, and he said for Drivin to go back with the boys to Elk City, and for Dalton to stay there for excavation of the technology. To this day, I could tell you not one thing about that. But there's a whole story behind it. Guards was on their way and was to be posted all around the site. Them Delta Force boys meant business with their orders to shoot to kill. Drivin escorted the boys back to Elk City and stayed the night before leaving on out the next morning for Crow Creek. Now, it was around about 2 in the morning when they busted in on Joe and Buster. Rooms had to be shared because there just wasn't enough of them to go around for all the men. Drivin and Jesse bunked together, and Walter and Howard throwed their bedrolls in the same room too. The pilots took the last room. When Pavel and the thug with him kicked in the door, Buster was a-waiting for him. Reckon they would have been killed dead if he hadn't heard him outside the door when he got up to get an extra blanket. Now, Buster grabbed Pavel round the goozle and was taking a bit of a thrashing, but he didn't turn him loose. Joe throwed a lamp at the thug, and he missed as he fired his pistol. Drivin and the boys come a-running and helped Buster hog-tie Pavel. One of the pilots shot the thug in the head and put him out of commission. Well, Drivin began to question Pavel, and Drivin wanted to know how they come to follow him. Well, old Pavel just laughed and showed them ugly teeth of his and said it was the tracking device they implanted in Joe's left eyebrow where they whacked him during interrogating him. Old Joe never even knowed it was there until now. Drivin called Mr. Holmes and Dalton and told them what all happened and said he was going to bring them to Washington for further questioning. Now, one of the pilots was left to guard Pavel whilst the boys loaded up Buster's Ford, and Drivin helped get the plane ready for immediate takeoff. In the meantime, Pavel had a trick or two up his sleeve and got to a hidden handcuff key and got it loose. He jumped the pilot and poleaxed him with the chair he was sitting in. Then he escaped to the helicopter he and his thug come in. Now, Pavel was a pilot too and could fly most any kind of aircraft. Well, Walter and Howard seen Pavel get to the helicopter and they run to Bell to chase him. Well, Howard took off chasing Pavel and Bell. Now, Pavel's helicopter couldn't outrun each other, but they was about even when it come to speed. Howard was right on his tail when Pavel began to shoot at Bell. Walter still had his in Mac 10 and opened up on the helicopter. And Howard had his in pistol he was give during the chase in St. Louis too, so they had some firepower. Oh, me. Neither one of the aircraft could get away from the other, and Howard hollered to Walter if he could hold on a wing walk until he got near Pavel's open cockpit door. Well, Walter said, heck yeah, let her bump. Well, now you know them boys used to wing walk for fun when they first got the old Bell. Well, there was one grenade in Howard's coat that he got when he got out of the SUV, and he give it to Walter. Howard asked him if he got close enough, if he could toss it in on Pavel. Walter said to consider it done, just get him close enough for a good throw. Well, I told Walter this was going to be a bit scary, but to hang on and he would get him close enough to bring him down. Well, Howard pulled straight up, spiraled, rolled, dove, and come up under the helicopter. Well, Howard made a move and brought Bell right next to the open door in the helicopter. Walter only needed a split second, and them G's had him puckered up like a green persimmon, but he made the throw. Walter had already pulled the pin, and after 1,001, he chunked the grenade in the open door right in Pavel's lap. You should have seen the look on his face when that grenade come flying in. And that was 1,002. 1,003 come after Howard banked hard left, and then there wasn't nothing but a ball of flame. Well, Howard landed, and Walter got down off of the wing, and Buster and Jesse told Howard that his practicing them tricks sure paid off. Walter said it sure was a rush, but didn't care to do it again. Now, Mr. Holmes was called again, and Devane briefed him on what happened. After everything settled down, Devane left back to Crow Creek, and the boys went to Uncle Cecil's the next day. There was a backslapping, and Aunt Liz said she was praying with the rest of the folks, and phone calls were made to let the boys' folks know they was all right. Aunt Liz had Uncle Cecil throw some steaks on the grill and chicken for Jesse. Uncle Cecil called Sam after supper, and they all agreed to crank up the drilling as soon as possible. The crew was awaiting for word, so drilling was to commence as soon as they could get the equipment moved in. Joe and the boys hit on several more shallow wells when they was approached by a feller named Robert A. Hefner III. He wanted to buy out Joe and the boys with his and two partners, Laney Glover and Roger Kennedy. GHK Exploration would give them cash up front and some stock in the company, plus a royalty on the gas sold. The deal was to stand with Sonat, and they was to drill one more well together that Joe was bound and determined to do. She was called the Bertha Rogers, the deepest drill well in the western world at 31,441 feet. It was the culmination of Joe's dream. When the boys left out of Elk City to home, they dropped off Walter and Jesse in Oklahoma City to pick up Walter's new car he done ordered. He got him one of them Lamborghinis and had Jesse to ride along with him back to the house. Jesse said to Walter, would he just like to drive it once, you mind? Walter said, of course, you can drive it, as he knowed Jesse never did drive fast. Well, Jesse pulled out on the I-40 and let the hammer down. Well, Jesse throwed old Walter so far back in his seat it'd take to Sunday to get him out of it. He was pasted to it. Jesse topped her out at about 185 with Walter just a squealing to Jesse to slow down. Well, Jesse looked over to Walter and said, turnabout is fair play and just don't never judge a book by its cover. Walter never done that again. Well, this is Old Buster about to finish up on this story for you folks. Appreciate it. Y'all have a blessed day, and I'll see you next time. Check.